Hi friends, I hope you're doing well and being intentional about your self-love. This video is the last in our series on loving ourselves, and today we're exploring one of those aspects of self-love that can be difficult and a little awkward, but is so important. It's about setting and maintaining healthy boundaries. So let's jump right in. As always, let's begin by centering ourselves. Do whatever helps you to feel comfortable and grounded, and take a moment to prepare your heart and mind for today's practice. And when you're ready, take a moment to check in with yourself. And I invite you to call to mind 3 things in yourself or your life that need to be treasured and protected. They can be objects, people, feelings, interests, or an aspect of yourself or your life. Just sit with these things for a moment and reflect on them in more detail. What makes them so precious to you? And what do you need or want to do to protect them? Make a note of anything you might want to spend more time with later, and then make some time now just to be with yourself. And if it's helpful, you may want to share in this prayer. Today I give thanks for me, for my uniqueness, my quirkiness, my particular foibles and fascinations, my abilities and aptitudes. I give thanks for what I'm able to bring to my world, my relationships, my work, my play, my creativity. And as I celebrate the self that I am becoming, I recognize that I need to be nurtured, protected, valued, and loved. I'm grateful for the knowledge that my boundaries are necessary and legitimate, and that I can expect those who truly love me to respect and honor them, and to help me to maintain them. Today I give thanks for me, and for everyone who values me enough to love and protect me, even sometimes from myself. There was a time in Debbie and my life where we lived in a neighborhood with fairly small properties, and the houses were very close together. It was a neighborhood where there was a lot of rejuvenation happening. People were buying properties and breaking them down and building them up, and there was some security issues, so everybody had quite high walls. And we had neighbors next door who battled a bit with boundaries. I remember the husband's name was Ralph. I never met his wife, so I'm not sure what her name was, but I remember one day our cat was on heat, and she was lying on the roof of Debbie's car on her back, spread-eagled, yowling at the top of her voice, because with the high walls, clearly it was a little difficult for the neighborhood boy cats to get to her, and she was feeling a bit desperate by that stage. And obviously the noise had traveled across the wall to our neighbors, and we caught this glimpse of Ralph, a bit like Kilroy was here, looking over the wall to try and see what was going on. We knew that he didn't think that we were very good pet owners. He, I think, was a bit worried that we were abusing our pets. Clearly didn't think that we fed our dog well enough, because he would often feed our dog biltong, a South African treat that's made of dried meat. And he would stop past and feed biltong to our dog. Or the one night there was a knock on our door, because our dog, who had a perfectly good shelter that we'd made, very comfortably set up with food and water and blankets, he had forgone that to go and stand out in the rain at the gate to watch the world going by. And Ralph was very worried and wanted to buy us a kennel. And really wasn't too sure about where the boundaries were. And we had a bit of a time with Ralph trying to set those boundaries up with him. For years, I accepted and absorbed boundary violations like this from all sorts of people, neighbors, friends, all over the place, because I was trying to be loving and gracious, but I didn't realize how my soul was getting bruised, how my sense of self was being stolen from me, and how I was opening myself to abuse from others. It took me years to learn to even begin setting boundaries. And to be honest, I still struggle. But I've learned that setting boundaries helps me to feel safer and more relaxed. It reduces my fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And it helps me to show up more fully, authentically, and courageously in my life and in my relationships. But I've also learned that setting boundaries is not just important for my own mental and emotional health. It's a gift I give to others, not just to myself. When boundaries are clear, then everyone knows where they stand, conflict is reduced, and we all feel safer. And when we learn to honor one another's boundaries, we give each other the gifts of dignity and respect. We feel seen and cared for, and we can all be more authentic with one another. The bottom line is this: setting boundaries is one of the most loving things we can do for ourselves and for those around us. And we cannot fully love ourselves until we learn to set good boundaries and maintain them. But that's a little easier said than done. So it's important that we make setting boundaries a spiritual practice that feeds our souls, supports our journey into our best self and our best life, and nurtures our healthiest relationships with ourselves and others. So how do we go about setting good boundaries? Well, I'm still learning, but perhaps it'll be helpful if I share some of the specific boundary setting practices that I'm working on. And the first one is this: we need to learn to say no. It's tempting to think we can set boundaries and everyone around us will accept and adhere to them, but I'm afraid that's not how this works. Some people will automatically accept and support our boundaries, and those people are gold. Cherish them. But most people will push back on your boundaries to see if they'll stay in place, because your boundaries make you less available to them on their terms, and people don't like that very much. What this means is that in setting our boundaries, we have to constantly be willing to say no to the demands, expectations, requests, and invasions of others. Some of what others ask will be legitimate, and we'll still need to say no. Some of what others ask won't be legitimate, and saying no is essential to avoid exploitation and/or abuse. And only you are the arbiter of what is legitimate or not when people are making demands on you or asking things of you. Yes, it's kind and gracious to negotiate boundaries with those closest to us, but ultimately, we get to decide what boundaries we need to set as an act of self-love. Which leads me to the second thing I'm learning. I have to get comfortable with the discomfort of others. I'm not responsible for how other people respond to or feel about my boundaries. If my boundaries upset them or make them feel negatively toward me, that tells me something about them, and it's important to listen to that. When people refuse to respect our boundaries, they are refusing to respect us, and that's not okay. Again, where appropriate for the relationship, boundaries can and should be negotiated. Those close to us have legitimate calls on us and our resources. That's what a relationship is. But they don't have the right to abuse us, to demand more than we are able to give, or to feel that they can ignore our boundaries at will. Those who love us in the best and truest way will always want to respect our boundaries and support us in setting and maintaining them, even if it is inconvenient for them. In fact, the people who love us most will generally not be hurt, upset, or negative about our boundaries at all. They'll celebrate that we're putting them in place. But when dealing with those who resist our boundary setting and get upset about our boundaries, it's important to remember that we are not responsible for their feelings. And the more comfortable we can get with the discomfort of others, the better it will be in our quest to set our boundaries. And then thirdly, it's important that we recognize that we need to set boundaries in every part of our lives. Over the last few weeks in the Evo Faith podcast, we've spoken about loving our bodies, hearts, and minds, and each of those areas needs us to set good boundaries. Sometimes people get into our heads and they demand to know every thought, or they are so overpowering that they silence our voices and our opinions, and they force us to think and believe as they do. And their voices can become loud and controlling in our heads. And we had a video about the voices in our heads a few weeks ago. And so we need to set boundaries on our minds and on our thinking to keep those coercive voices at bay. Sometimes people try to control our emotions so that we only feel and express those that are acceptable to them. Now, I'm not talking about when people set legitimate boundaries to protect themselves against irrational anger or manipulation. I'm talking about when we are only allowed to be happy or positive or nice, and so-called negative emotions are constantly shut down. And so we need to be willing to set boundaries around our emotions, because when we do, and when those boundaries are respected, we're less likely to get triggered and end up in an emotional meltdown. And sometimes people ignore our physical and spatial boundaries and feel that they can take liberties with our personal space and our bodies. I remember speaking once to a pregnant mom who was feeling vulnerable and hurt because so many people, even strangers, felt that they had a right to place their hands on her tummy. They didn't even consider that her pregnant body was hers and that she may not want to be touched so freely and carelessly. I also remember reading a story about two men who met at a conference. They connected and the conversation was lively and friendly, but they clearly had different ideas of personal space. The one man was from Texas, where he was used to wide open spaces and needed lots of distance between himself and others to feel comfortable. The other man was from New York City, where people live in high-density apartment buildings. He needed much less space to feel comfortable around others. The result was that as these men talked, the New Yorker would step close, and a few minutes later, the Texan would step back to create more space. And this dance took them circling around the entire room as they were speaking. Now, I could go on about setting boundaries around our prized possessions, our personal time and solitude, our interests, our finances, our appearance, or our work, but you get the idea. Boundary setting isn't something we do in only one area. It's not set and forget. It's a constant practice. It applies in all the different areas of our lives, and we will want different boundaries with different people and in different aspects of our lives and at different times. And that's why setting boundaries is a spiritual practice. We need to be doing it constantly, mindfully, thoughtfully, carefully, and we need to constantly be learning to do it better. When it comes to loving ourselves, it's not just about how we relate to ourselves, seeing our value, listening to ourselves, making meaning of our lives in healthy ways, loving our bodies, minds, and hearts. It's also about how we relate to others, how we protect ourselves from harm, how we retain our sense of self in relationship with others, and how we maintain healthy boundaries. Our relationship with others is as much part of our self-love as the way we relate to ourselves. And when we learn to love ourselves well, we are empowered to connect with others more deeply, to engage with the world more intentionally, and to show up in our lives more creatively, courageously, and authentically. And so I hope this whole series around loving ourselves has been helpful for you. And I hope it will inspire and liberate you to love yourself the way you deserve and need, including in the boundaries that you need to set and maintain. And so sit with these thoughts for a few moments. What ideas, emotions, physical feelings, or questions arise in you? Be sure to journal any that will need more attention through this week. And now take some time to check in with yourself and listen to what your deepest self is saying. I invite you to make a note of at least 3 boundaries that you want to set or maintain more intentionally in your life. Affirm these boundaries as legitimate. And if it's helpful for you, create a simple ritual that will help you to remember and honor these boundaries. It can be having 3 candles, one for each boundary that you light each day, or you can make an altar with symbols or pictures that represent these 3 boundaries. Or you can create affirmations to say each day. It doesn't matter what specific ritual you use, just something that works for you. And you also may want to spend some time this week journaling about your boundaries and how you want to work with them more intentionally and healthily. And then when you're ready, bring your practice to a close in whatever way helps you to prepare for the challenges and joys of your daily living. As you go through the week ahead, I encourage you to become aware and intentional around your boundaries. You might also want to write a love letter to yourself, focusing on the 3 boundaries you've identified. Write it a little at a time, or write the whole thing at once, whatever feels right to you. But try to connect with this letter and with the boundaries you're focusing on each day. Again, the key is to be intentional about your self-love through the week. And that's the end of today's practice. I hope it's been empowering and helpful for you, and I hope this series has too. What's your experience of and your relationship with boundaries? What has helped you to be more intentional about setting and maintaining your boundaries? What one thing would you suggest to someone who needs help setting and maintaining boundaries? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And now thank you for taking the time to share in this practice. I'll see you next time.